On a cold November night in 1975, a ship once hailed as the largest freighter on the lakes vanished into the dark waters of Lake Superior without a single distress call.
I got seas going right across my deck here now.
She was the Edmund Fitzgerald, the most celebrated and one of the safest freighters of her time. Strong, state-of-the-art, and commanded by one of the most experienced captains on the lakes. Yet in one violent storm, she and her 29-man crew disappeared without a trace. What brought down this mighty ship? Was it rogue waves, a hidden reef, or something deep within the Fitzgerald herself? 50 years later, and the legend lives on. The mystery remains. This is the story of her life, her loss, and the men who never came home. This is the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald, the full story on Part-Time Explorer. For such a heavy video about a tragedy that still carries significant emotional weight for families and friends of those who were lost, we've decided not to accept a sponsor for this video. But we do want to thank our supporters on Patreon for helping make this documentary financially possible. You can visit my Patreon at the link in the description below. The wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald has haunted the Great Lakes for half a century. 2025 marks the 50th anniversary of when she was lost, and with that we look back not only on the mystery of her loss, but at the world that she belonged to. A world of steel giants, treacherous waters, and the men who tamed them. In the 50 years since she was lost, countless theories have been suggested as to why she went down, but none can be proven. No matter how heated the debates, we simply don't know how this behemoth vanished. But we're going to look at this wreck closely, relying on experts who have studied this wreck since the night the ship went down.
My name is Frederick Stonehouse. I am a maritime historian. I taught maritime history at Northern Michigan University and have authored somewhat north of 30 different publications that deal with maritime history either on the Great Lakes or open ocean.
Fred Stonehouse has researched the ship extensively for 50 years and has been involved in every single expedition to the wreck to some degree. We're also working with a unique digital model to enhance the animations that we frequently work with on these projects. The base of our Edmund Fitzgerald model was made by engineering students at Clemson University under the guidance of programming wizard Jerry Tessendorf.
I developed something that these days the buzzword for it is a digital twin that sort of simulates environments.
We finished off the model and will be giving back our complete asset to the university as a thank you for their help. You cannot look closely at the Edmund Fitzgerald without traveling to her physically. Whitefish Point, Michigan is the closest spot to where she went down and is home to the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum. The museum has generously opened up their collection and materials to us. With these factors, and our crew's general expertise in maritime history, we're taking a new look at the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald. To understand the Fitzgerald, we must first understand the stage that she sailed upon. The Great Lakes are inland seas, vast stretches of fresh water where storms rise with the fury of oceans. Waves here break with the same power as those on the Atlantic or the Pacific, and those who sail them know that November brings the most violent tempests of all. The lakes are a highway of industry, transporting goods and raw material long distances between factory ports in the United States and Canada. Our story begins in the 1950s with the dream of opening these Great Lakes to the rest of the world. At the time, the Great St. Lawrence Seaway was under construction. Now, this project had been talked about for decades, but was finally underway, and nearing completion by 1957. This large project was a series of canals and channels that enabled large, deep draft vessels to travel between the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence River, which would then link the lakes to the Atlantic Ocean. In the 1950s, the Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance Company of Milwaukee, Wisconsin was diversifying its investments and expanded into shipping iron ore on the Great Lakes. They contracted with the Great Lakes Engineering Works to build them a freighter. With the St. Lawrence Seaway soon to open, they specifically requested that this freighter would be the biggest ship possible, but still fitting within the limitations of the new Seaway. The Great Lakes Engineering Works laid her keel down in River Rouge, Michigan, just below Detroit, in August 1957, with the vessel rising up quickly over the fall and winter. Her construction being expedited by using prefabricated sections of the vessel being hoisted into place and assembled once the keel was finished. The final cost of the construction was $8.4 million, or nearly $100 million today. June 8, 1958 was her launch day. Thousands of spectators gathered, and the river filled with small crafts standing by to watch. Grandstands were set up for the people to view the ceremony. She was named the Edmund Fitzgerald, named for the president of the Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance Company, and she was christened by Elizabeth Fitzgerald, wife of Edmund. It took 3 times for her to break that bottle of champagne. Superstitious sailors would call that a bad omen. The ship splashed down into the water with a massive wave, bigger than expected, splashing the crowd and collapsing one of the grandstands. And the ship didn't stop. It glided through the water further than it should have. It bumped into the far side of the channel, almost out of control. So harrowing was her launch that a spectator had a heart attack, dying shortly afterward. Not a good start. But despite these eerie omens, the ship would do well for the start of her career. Once launched, she was lifted on a floating dry dock while the final work was done to the ship. Slowly, from bow to stern, the Fitzgerald was painted in her iconic reddish maroon. The ship was ready by September of that year, with a final celebration day held, where the public were allowed to come aboard and tour this new Queen of the Lakes. Hundreds of people toured the vessel, walking the decks, seeing the engine spaces, and exploring her crew quarters. This day was particularly popular among children. It seems school trips came out to visit the new ship. Concluding the ceremony, Mr. and Mrs. Fitzgerald presented a painting to the ship to be hung in the crew accommodations. It was a painting of the brig Columbia, the first ship to carry iron ore through the Soo Locks of the Great Lakes. The ship that pioneered the way for the Fitzgerald, having sailed over a century before. As the big freighters go, it was bigger than most. In fact, bigger than all. By rising up to the limitations of the St. Lawrence Seaway, this new freighter would be an absolute giant, the biggest ship on the lakes up to that point. She was 729 feet long, had a 75-foot beam, and a typical draft of 25 feet, and 13,632 gross tons. She was designed similarly to most other iron ore carriers at the time, but with improvements and upgrades made to it. A deckhouse stood on both the bow and stern of the ship with a long body between them for cargo holds. The forward deck house contained the officers' quarters, a recreation room, and 2 lavishly appointed staterooms provided for guests traveling on board. Considering she was a freighter, the quarters were surprisingly ornate, with tile in the bathrooms, special linens, leather furniture, and deep shag carpeting. Atop this forward deck house was the wheelhouse, the command center for the ship. To get to the other deck house at the aft end of the ship, one would usually walk the long and exposed length of the spar deck, but there were access tunnels running along the length of the ship on either side, just below the main deck, as a more sheltered alternative. As one moves along the deck heading aft, they would pass all 21 hatches on the open spar deck, which allowed ore to be poured into her 3 large holds. The holds ran along the center line of the vessel, but outboard of them were ballast tanks, which not only gave the ship stability when not carrying a load, but acted as a safety net in case the ships were damaged, preventing water from flooding into her massive open holds. The 3 holds were not separated by a watertight bulkhead, but instead just a heavy-duty screen, so the hold, even though it was technically 3 holds, was really all one giant compartment. Finally, we'd get to the after deck house, which contained additional crew quarters, the galley, and 3 dining rooms, 1 for the officers, 1 for guests, and 1 general mess. Beneath the aft deck house was the ship's engine room, which housed a Westinghouse steam turbine which generated 7,000 horsepower, giving the Fitzgerald a top speed of around 16 knots, faster than most other freighters of her type. Her boiler plant was initially coal-fired, although that would later change. She had several electrical generators and 3 different radios for communication with shore. All things told, the Fitzgerald was state-of-the-art, powerful, safe, and comfortable, and combined with her imposing size, she was soon called the Queen of the Lakes. After completing a week and a half of sea trials, the mighty Fitz was ready for service. Northwestern Mutual had neither the skills nor the interest to operate the vessel, but rather commissioned her to be chartered out. The Oglebay Norton Corporation signed a 25-year contract to use the ship, making her their flagship. She departed the shipyard on her delivery trip, steaming up past Detroit into Lake Huron and north from there to the Sioux Locks. This is Sault Ste. Marie, better known as Sioux City, Michigan. Here, an intricate system of canals and locks allow shipping to traverse between Lake Huron of eastern Michigan and Lake Superior to the north. As the Fitzgerald approached the locks for the first time, she was scheduled to pass through the MacArthur Lock, but as it got closer, it was quickly realized that the Fitzgerald was likely too big to fit through that lock and was diverted to the larger Sabin Lock instead. As she passed through, crowds gathered right here along the waterfront to watch the new behemoth pass by. Once in Lake Superior, she set a heading for Silver Bay, Minnesota, where she would take on her first load of cargo. She would have one job during her entire service, a very straightforward utilitarian career. These are taconite pellets. They're made of low-grade iron ore mixed with clay. This is how iron ore is shipped from where it's mined in Minnesota to the steel mills in Detroit, Michigan, or Toledo, Ohio, 700 miles away. She moored at Silver Bay to pick up a shipment of these pellets from the Reserve Mining Company to be taken to Toledo, Ohio, and then shipped down to a mill owned by Reserve Mining's parent company, Armco. While the ship loaded up, our camera crew walked away, picked berries, and played with a bear. I'm not joking, this is all on the same film reel. By the time they came back to the ship, she was almost ready to go. She was initially intended to carry 26,000 tons of iron ore, but it was determined that the water level was too low at the time in the channel. Concerned about her draft and the possibility of bottoming out as she made her way through the channels out into the lake, they loaded the Fitzgerald with only 20,000 tons for her first voyage. Her maiden voyage began on September 24, 1958, under the command of Captain Bert Lampert. When she passed through the Soo Locks again, heading back with her cargo on her maiden voyage, she set the record for the heaviest cargo carried through by one ship up to that point. And again, she could have been carrying much more had she been filled to capacity. As the ship made its way through the locks or through the channels in and out of port, the pilot disembarked the ship by being slung off as the ship was in motion. From the Soo Locks, the ship continued down Lake Huron to the St. Clair River. As it entered the river, it passed by Port Huron. A mail carrier boat puttered out to greet the Fitzgerald as it steamed by. On board that mail boat was a reporter who wrote in awe about how imposing the new vessel was as he came up alongside it. Quote, "The Fitzgerald at that point had no shape or beauty. It was just a long piece of steel. It was so big, and we were so close, that the outlines of the bow and stern were beyond range of vision." The Fitzgerald did not stop. It slowly steamed past the small craft, lowering a bucket down to it. Crew on the small boat shoved mail and newspapers into the bucket, which were hoisted back on board. The journalist closed his article by saying, "Here's wishing a long life to this newest freighter to join the parade of ships passing by Port Huron's doorstep." She steamed down past Detroit once more to her destination, Toledo, Ohio, where the iron ore was delivered to the Armco Steel Company. It would take around 14 hours to unload all cargo from the Fitzgerald. Giant mechanical arms would reach into the hold and pull the ore out, and often a tractor was lowered into the holds by crane to then shove the ore pellets into bigger piles to make sure that that arm could reach it all. Then the ore pellets would be taken right to a steel mill, being turned into who knows what. The ship would continue to sail for the remainder of the season until around November of that year, when fierce storms suddenly whip into the Great Lakes region, making lake travel impossible for the rest of the winter. That began the Fitzgerald's off-season, when she sat in layup and received routine maintenance. By the next season, the Fitzgerald had a new captain, Captain Newman Larson. The Fitzgerald would go through 4 captains throughout her career. The first season had Captain Lampert. Next was Captain Larson. In 1966, command was given to Captain Peter Pulser, and in 1972, Captain Ernest McSorley. The ship was a celebrity on the lakes, and so were her captains. Captain Pulser, for example, was known to blast music on the ship's speakers as it steamed through the locks and down rivers, and regularly called out greetings to people waving from the shore. Now, it might seem hard to imagine how a conversation can be held between the captain and spectators on shore, but looking at this shot of the freighter Great Republic moving through the Soo Locks, it's a bit easier to imagine. There were ship spotters back then, just as there are today. People who enjoy just sitting on the shore watching these big freighters sail to and fro. The Fitzgerald soon became a crowd favorite, especially among these ship fans. There's a charming story about Captain Pulser and the mighty Fitz. In 1969, a family with 2 young children were on the shore near Point Place. The Fitzgerald steamed by very close to the shore, and 2 young boys ran out to greet the ship. Captain Pulser on the bridge saw them and called back to them, "Hello kids, how are you today?" He talked with them for a moment as the ship steamed by, blasted some music at them, and gave them a whistle salute. This had a lasting impression on the 2 kids, who from then on referred to the captain as the happy captain of the happy boat. The family managed to come in contact with the captain, who invited them to tour the ship that October. They walked the entire vessel, having a grand time, and took lunch in the captain's cabin. Captain Pulser loaded the kids up with souvenirs as they left, and a memory that they would always cherish. Captain Pulser retired in 1972, and command of the Edmund Fitzgerald was taken over by Captain Ernest McSorley. Just like in the sailing days of old, it was common for captains and officers to bring their wives on voyages with them. They might quilt on the wheelhouse or bake cakes in the galley, adding a wonderful touch of home to those long voyages, with some of the sailors not seeing their homes all season. The wives even furnished wonderful holiday meals, such as this fine spread laid out for Thanksgiving aboard the Edmund Fitzgerald. For a freighter, the Fitz sure was comfortable, with all sorts of modern amenities provided for her crew. As mentioned earlier, the Fitzgerald had passenger accommodations. Usually, if you were to sail on the Fitzgerald as a passenger, it was as a guest of one of the companies connected with the ship, or as family of the crew, or something like that.
If it could be a captain's wife or an officer's wife that accompanied that particular trip, it could be a corporate man from the company headquarters that was taking the trip with his family. It likewise could be businessman that had a relationship with the shipping company in some regard that was offered a trip on the boat.
The passengers had their own dining room in the starboard aft corner of the after deckhouse. And once per voyage, the captain was known to do a fine dinner by candlelight with special cocktails. Passengers soon fell into the rhythm of the lakes as the big ship drove onward.
It would be something you do in late spring, midsummer, to enjoy the great lakes that we have and what you're seeing and what you're doing, and more importantly, almost getting with the rhythm of the Great Lakes. It takes a few days to do that, to settle down to a nice boat trip on a great big freighter.
She was as comfortable as an ocean liner.
The passenger accommodations on Fitzgerald were considered to be probably the best in the fleet, certainly among the best of the Great Lakes vessels. I don't say that lightly. There were 135 vessels in the U.S. fleet, so the competition could be a little fierce for who had the best.
It wasn't all celebrations and fine dining with the Edmund Fitzgerald, though. She had a few structural problems that were fixed during her winter layups. She also bumped into the walls of the Soo locks a few times, and once grounded. In another incident, she collided with the freighter Hochelaga, sustaining minor damage. It seems that every recorded incident during the ship's early career happened at or near the Soo locks. But these incidents are insignificant to a ship like the Fitzgerald. If compared to driving a car, they might be a crack in a windshield or a flat tire, easily fixed and not really a concern. In fact, the Fitzgerald was known as one of the safest ships on the lakes, winning awards for being well run and working without a single incident that resulted in injury during her first several years of service. The ship set record after record, regularly besting its own records for heaviest cargo carried on the Great Lakes, most cargo carried during the season, and fastest voyages in addition to its safety record. The Fitzgerald was the triumphant hero of the Great Lakes, the MVP, a ship that sailors truly served on with pride. I don't make these sweeping claims lightly to boost the ship's status or to add drama to the tale. Her reputation was regularly talked about in the newspapers of the 1960s. In 1969, a bow thruster was installed to give the ship greater maneuverability in port, essentially eliminating the need for a tugboat to help the ship dock, resulting in the fastest and biggest ship of the lakes now being able to turn around in port significantly faster. At the tail end of 1971, during her winter layup, her boilers were converted from coal burning to oil burning. On January 7, 1974, right by downtown Detroit, the Fitzgerald had another little accident, and she lost her starboard anchor, which dropped down into the water and was left there. 30 years later, the anchor was rediscovered by divers and eventually recovered, and now sits outside the Dawson Great Lakes Museum on Bell Island. Throughout her career, the Coast Guard adjusted the permitted load line for the Fitzgerald, ultimately reducing her legal freeboard by over 3 feet, down to less than 12 feet. Now the Fitzgerald was permitted to sail with additional cargo and lower in the water. This reduction was done because the Coast Guard felt that the Fitzgerald was safer than initially believed, but these reductions did make her more vulnerable to larger waves and breaking seas. Other than that, as the ship worked its way through its 1975 season, she was very much the same vessel as when she was built 17 years prior. 17 years isn't old by any means with these lake freighters. The fresh water of the lakes, combined with the advanced engineering put into the construction of these vessels, means that they could, with proper care, stay in service indefinitely. The Herbert C. Jackson, for example, is very similar to the Fitzgerald structurally and was built 1 year after the Fitz. At nearly 70 years old today, she's still in service. So the Fitzgerald at 17 years old was still considered quite young. October 31st, 1975. An inspection of the spar deck was made on the Edmund Fitzgerald as it laid over in Toledo, Ohio, in order to best assess what repair work would need to be done over her winter layup that year. There were no serious issues found with the ship. Anything needed work was considered to just be routine, as the result of wear and tear. The most notable fault in the ship, however, was the number 4 hatch. There were cracks and gashes. These were considered insignificant. Sure, it could allow water to enter, but the ship had pumps that were designed to keep up with the hatch leaks. The hatches weren't even waterproof, so the ship was built to be able to take a little bit of water through the hatches. She had 6 different pumps, 2 different types. She was well equipped to pump water out of her holds and her ballast tanks. The Fitzgerald was permitted to finish the season before these problems were addressed, since there were really only about 2 weeks left before winter would set in. The season was drawing to a close. It's usually around mid-November when the skies turn gloomy, when the winter winds roll onto the Great Lakes, marking the end of safe passage on the lakes for the year.
By far, November is the worst time to be on the Great Lakes, followed by October and, of course, September as the fall builds up. Sometimes it's been referred to as the Witch of November, but it truly is the worst time to be moving cargo or boating in any way on especially Lake Superior.
Another voyage and a half later, the Edmund Fitzgerald was docked at the Burlington Northern Railroad Dock Number 1. This dock right here, still standing today. Although she often moored at mining plants like Silver Bay on her first voyage, she frequently came along massive ore docks like these, where she was loaded with taconite pellets. Billions of these pellets were hauled from the mines down to the lake and brought out onto these ore docks by train. The Fitzgerald would position itself alongside the dock, and chutes would lower down over each of the open hatchways. A crewman would stand on deck and give hand signals to guide the ship to be perfectly aligned with these ore chutes. Long trains of hoppers would continuously move up onto the ore dock and dump the pellets into these chambers, the trains moving in and out as the ships filled. When a chamber was spent, the ship would move down the dock, working its way along. Slowly, over the course of 4 or 5 hours, ore would fill all 3 holds of the ship until she sat low in the water. Iron ore was loaded into the ship as usual, 26,116 tons of it, in the form of taconite pellets. It was a heavy load, but not a record breaker. This was likely to be the Fitzgerald's final voyage of the season. Storms were brewing to the south, making their way north. the Fitzgerald would travel down to Detroit, drop off the cargo, and begin her winter layover in Toledo. The weather on Lake Superior was beautiful on November 9th, but 700 miles away, a fierce storm was brewing.
The storm formed in central Kansas on 9 November 1975 and rapidly began to move to the northeast.
Although it doesn't have an eye or anything like that, you can kind of think of the storm out against center, and the motion is sort of counterclockwise a little bit like larger storm systems are. At the moment that the Edmund Fitzgerald was planning to leave port, it was the storm was still in the Midwest, and it was forecast to move up north and take a path that was east of Lake Superior, and in fact, it did not go east of Lake Superior, it went right over Lake Superior, and so the wind pattern from it was very different from what the forecast was.
She was over central Lake Superior the following day, packing some really ferocious winds. Some of the winds on the open lake were clocked at over 90 miles an hour. Now remember, a Category 1 hurricane is 74 miles an hour. So these were truly hurricane winds. The Weather Service, of course, does not recognize hurricanes on the Great Lakes, so that term in connection with the Fitzgerald is very rarely used. But it was a vicious time on the lake. Some of the waves reported in excess of 40 feet. The Weather Service admitted to waves in excess of 25 feet. So it truly was a bad storm, though it was not nearly the worst of the storms that ever struck the lakes. Go back to 1913, November 13, when the great blow of that year came through that quite literally damaged, wrecked 47 different vessels on the Great Lakes, killed 250 sailors, sank 9 modern steel iron ore carriers with all hands and locations unidentified. Only this year was the last one of them the Carruthers finally found.
This storm now brewing in Kansas was projected to miss Lake Superior, but the weather agency was terribly wrong.
The storms that generate out of the southwest are really the nastiest ones. Every time that there's been a big storm in the lake, that's where it came from.
At 2:15 p.m., November 9th, 1975, the Edmund Fitzgerald pulled away from dock number 1, making its way out of the harbor and into Lake Superior, bound for Zug Island, Detroit. No passengers for this voyage, but her crew was made up of 29 men. No one on board would be seen alive again. The best testimony of the following tale comes from the closest witnesses to the story, the crew of the freighter Arthur M. Anderson. The captain of the Anderson was Bernie Cooper, on watch with his officers in the wheelhouse. An often overlooked detail of this voyage is that there actually is a woman on board the Anderson as well.
The chief engineer's wife was making a trip, and she spent about 6 hours with a life jacket on in the hallway because the seas were so big.
Around this time, the Anderson had just left Two Harbors, Minnesota, carrying a load of taconite pellets bound for Gary, Indiana, which means the ship would follow the exact same route as the Fitzgerald, for most of the way at least.
When we left Two Harbors, it was the most beautiful day you ever saw in your life.
She steamed into the lake and soon spotted the Fitzgerald about 15 miles ahead of her as the day was ending. At about 7 p.m. that evening, the first warning of gale force winds was issued as a storm was approaching.
Whenever you start to get gale warnings, the word goes around the ship. We call all the galley, we call the engineers, and you send your forward end crew around to dog everything down, to make sure everything is tight. You check your clamps on your deck.
Captain Cooper of the Arthur M. Anderson got on his radio and called the Edmund Fitzgerald to establish contact and discuss these weather warnings. Throughout the night, the weather deteriorated. Winds intensified to 52 knots, officially storm force winds, and wave heights were reaching 10 feet, nearly cresting over the Fitzgerald's decks. Around 2 a.m., Captain Cooper radioed the Fitzgerald to once more discuss the weather and determine the best course of action. Usually, the American freighters sailed along the southern route through Lake Superior, the fastest channel between Superior and the Soo Locks of Sault Ste. Marie. However, they were more exposed to the weather down there. There was a longer but more sheltered route to the north, which would eventually take them into Canadian waters. After a brief discussion, Captains Cooper and McSorley agreed. The northern, longer route was the best option given the weather warnings. The two vessels adjusted course. There must have been a concern among the crews. The Fitzgerald picked up speed and began pulling away from the Anderson, hoping to stay ahead of the weather. The Anderson was only able to keep pace by cutting corners off of their course, but she was still falling behind. The waves pounded the two ships, steaming forward in the darkness. Dawn broke with the ships still on their rough course. The wind subsided throughout the morning, but the waves persisted. Between 1 and 2 in the afternoon, the two vessels passed Michipicoten Island, near the Canadian shore of the eastern side of the lake, steaming south-southeast towards the Soo Locks, still over 100 miles ahead. The storm had calmed significantly, but it was expected to regain strength shortly, with winds coming from the west. Before the ships would reach the Soo Locks, they'd enter a more sheltered part of the lake called Whitefish Bay, defined by a large peninsula jutting into Lake Superior called Whitefish Point. So just around this point is Whitefish Bay, and that was a very common shelter for storms because the whole peninsula of Whitefish Point protects the bay over there. The storms come up from this way, and the landmass sort of provides a bit of a shelter or a shield from that. If the ships could at least round Whitefish Point Peninsula into the shelter of the bay, they'd be able to bunker down and weather the storm. They just had 90 miles to go. Captain Cooper once more called the Fitzgerald on the radio and spoke with Captain McSorley. Cooper reported that he'd be shifting his ship so that the stern was pointed into the wind as they passed the island, but McSorley said that he'd keep on going as he was, having already passed that island. It was then that McSorley gave the first indication that something might be amiss. He said that the Fitzgerald was rolling some. That, in and of itself, doesn't mean anything, but it's our first clue that the ship is behaving out of the ordinary. The Edmund Fitzgerald wasn't usually much of a roller. The Fitz was about 9 miles ahead at this point, with Anderson's crew keeping her within sight. As 3 p.m. approached, the storms did, too. Winds increased from 5 knots to 45 knots, or over 50 miles per hour. The seas became choppier, and snow squalls ripped through the area. Visibility diminished, and the Fitzgerald faded away from the view of the Anderson. This was the last time that anyone would directly see the ship above the surface. As the visibility dropped, the two ships depended entirely on radar for navigation. With Michipicoten Island behind them, another island lay ahead, Caribou Island, with its deadly 6-fathom shoal to its north. Captain Cooper adjusted the course of the Anderson to avoid the shoal safely. As they did, they watched the Fitzgerald on radar, now 16 miles ahead, cutting very close to that dangerous shoal, closer than Captain Cooper would have comfortably taken his own vessel. Cooper was concerned for the Fitzgerald, which could easily ground and wreck on that shoal. It was then, as Cooper was worrying, at 3:30 p.m. that he received a call from McSorley on the Fitzgerald. This was the first time that the Fitzgerald had called him. "Anderson, this is the Fitzgerald. I have sustained some topside damage. I have a fence rail laid down, 2 vents lost or damaged, and a starboard list. I'm checking down. Will you stay by me till I get to Whitefish?
Well, he called me up. That was 3:10 in the afternoon. And he said, I've got a little problem. He said, my fence rail is down. He said, I've got 2 vents missing, and I've taken a starboard list.
Cooper confirmed that and asked if the Fitzgerald had his pumps running, pumping water out of the ship. McSorley responded that yes, he does. He has both running, but water is coming in as fast as they can pump it out. Now, as I said, the Fitzgerald had 6 different pumps, and he says he has both running. 2 smaller ones and 4 larger ones with a higher capacity. He probably had both types running, which is probably what he meant by both are on.
I don't care what anybody says. At 3:10 in the afternoon, she had either bottomed out or had a stress fracture of the hull. That's the only 2 possibilities I have. She was sinking from that time on, Tom.
The Fitzgerald was damaged and begun limping. The rolling that McSorley mentioned earlier no doubt increased with this new damage. The 2 vents that he says that he lost are a bit of a mystery. What vents was he referring to? It's generally believed that he was referring to the vents on the ballast tanks. The greater question posed by this call is, what exactly caused this damage? The fence rail down especially would not have been caused by a wave. Some believe that some sort of floating heavy object adrift on the lake may have crashed across the Fitzgerald's decks. Or did something happen with that treacherous shoal that they were passing by that Cooper was worried about? But the ship limped on. The damage still seemed to be routine, and the crew of the Anderson did not believe that there was any need for extra worry. Nor did the Fitzgerald put out a call for help. All was still mostly normal as the ships continued navigating on their instruments. Still, the vessels were making good progress, even as the winds and the seas were picking up. The winds were behind them, after all, essentially giving them a tailwind. Waves crashed over the deck of the Anderson, no doubt over the Fitzgerald as well. Every wave that they struck reverberated a loud thud from stem to stern. And then the storm grew more fierce. The U.S. Coast Guard issued an urgent warning to all ships on the lake. Get out. Get to safe anchorage immediately. The Soo locks were now closed, and any large freighters in the area were now making a beeline straight for the shelter of Whitefish Point. That was the safe haven that the Fitzgerald and the Anderson were racing towards, watching their radars as they made their way closer, with the Fitzgerald leading the Anderson now by 17 miles. The wind in the wires made a tattletale sound. Winds were howling, with some places reporting gusts up to 96 miles an hour. This was hurricane force. Visibility was minimal, with the snow squalls blowing through, and the sun behind the impenetrable clouds starting to set. Something happened on the Fitzgerald. Exactly what it was, we don't know, but as a result of it, her radars went down, both her primary and her backup system. The ship was now steaming completely blind, with snow squalls and foaming seas in her way. There was one more hope for guiding the ship into Whitefish. This is the lighthouse at Whitefish Point. Today it is the oldest operating lighthouse on Lake Superior, having been established in 1849, and the current tower having been built in 1861. The light can be seen up to 28 miles away. A radio beacon is also present here at Whitefish, acting as a sort of lighthouse on the radio waves, too. As the Fitzgerald fell blind, her crew desperately looked for both the lighthouse light and searched for the radio beacon on their signals, but neither were showing up. Captain McSorley jumped on the radio and called a nearby vessel, the Swedish ship Avafors, to ask if they were receiving the Whitefish Point beacon. No, they weren't. So it wasn't a problem with Fitzgerald's receiver. It turns out the station's power was down due to the high winds, and the Fitz was beyond the range of their battery-powered backup system. That was it. Fitzgerald had no guidance whatsoever. They did the last thing possible. Captain McSorley called up the Anderson. He said, "Anderson, this is the Fitzgerald. I have lost both radars. Can you provide me with radar plots till I reach Whitefish Bay?" Captain Cooper had stepped off the bridge, but Anderson's first mate got on the radio and confirmed that they would assist the Fitzgerald. The Arthur M. Anderson would now be watching the Fitzgerald on their own radar systems and guiding the ship remotely through the radio. They looked at their radar and plotted their two positions. The Anderson was now 7.5 miles south of the northern point of Caribou Island. The Fitzgerald was 15 miles ahead of them, slowing down. The sun set at 5:12, and with that the Fitzgerald received a call. It was the Swedish ship Avafors following up on their previous communications. They had the Whitefish light in sight, but there was still no indication that the beacon was functioning. Captain McSorley confirmed that this is good news, that at least the light is visible. But then, the crew of the Avafors overheard something. From McSorley. He still had the transmit button held down on the radio, but he yelled something to another crewman on the bridge. "Don't allow nobody on deck." They heard other words being shouted by McSorley to the crew, but they couldn't understand it. Now, it's probably a combination of the garbling of the radio and the fact that English is not their first language. They think they heard him say something about the vents, but they weren't sure. McSorley came back on the radio to Avafors, reporting to him that he had a bad list, that he's lost both his radars, and that heavy seas are coming over the deck. McSorley told the Avafors that this was the worst sea he had ever experienced. What was crashing over the Fitzgerald was known as green water. There's white water, which is foam and sea spray, where waves splash up onto the deck. Green water means that the decks are actually submerging under the rolling waves. The waves moving over the deck have actual mass. The stress on her hull must have been unbelievably great. The Anderson was experiencing the same conditions. They were in this together, both battling the worst conditions imaginable. 15 miles apart, different shipping lines, but brothers in arms. The Anderson once more fixed the Fitzgerald's position on their radar and radioed it to them. The Fitzgerald had less than 35 miles to go before she reached safe harbor. She was making it. 6 p.m., and the storm had increased violently. 25-foot waves crashed over the Anderson, smashing into her deckhouse, stretching and flexing the ship.
But I know the ship was laboring. We weren't rolling much. You know, the sea was pretty much right after. But with all that extra water on deck, at times, I had as much as 12 feet on my deck at times. And I know my hatch crane was completely buried a few times.
The Fitzgerald had slowed down a bit to allow the Anderson to gain some ground on her, closing the gap by about a mile an hour. The Fitzgerald was beginning to pull to the east, though, drifting more and more off course. So noticeable was this that the Anderson's crew could see this on their radar over time, and so they called the Fitzgerald up and told them to adjust their heading a little bit to compensate. Around 6:30, a massive shudder bound through the Anderson. A 35 to 40 foot wave plowed into the ship's stern, the biggest wave Captain Cooper had ever seen. It smashed over the ship, seemingly completely submerging her after deckhouse, damaging both lifeboats and rolling forward toward the bow. It slammed into the forward deckhouse, briefly putting the whole bow underwater. A moment later, a second wave of just the same height slammed into the Anderson once more, shuddering the vessel violently. putting her underwater until she surfaced again. If Cooper's estimate of the wave being between 35 and 40 feet is accurate, that makes both of these waves around 10 feet higher than the highest ever recorded wave on Lake Superior.
Those two seas were the biggest that we ever had going down there. And it happened about 6:30 in the evening. And I just wonder if those two seas didn't catch up with the Fitzgerald.
7 p.m. Waves crashed and winds howled. The Anderson watched the Fitzgerald on radar, reporting her to be about 15 miles from shore. Another hour or an hour and a half, and she'd be rounding Whitefish Point for shelter, where several other ships had just anchored to wait out the storm. That's it. She just had to hold on for another hour or so. Captain Cooper was out of the wheelhouse when Anderson's first mate, a man named Morgan Clark, noticed another ping on the radar, another vessel about 9 miles ahead of the Fitzgerald and closing. It was actually a ship coming out from Whitefish Bay, heading out into the lake despite the storm warnings. Clark called the Fitzgerald to let him know about this other vessel. McSorley asked Clark if he's going to clear this vessel, wondering if he needs to adjust course or not. Clark responded that that wasn't needed. The two vessels would safely pass, as it was. McSorley acknowledged. Before signing off, Clark questioned McSorley. "Oh, by the way, how are you making out with your problem?" "We are holding our own, going along like an old shoe," McSorley replied. Going along like an old shoe is a common phrase among Great Lakers to say that everything is comfortable and under control. Captain Cooper returned to the bridge as that message arrived.
Yeah, Morgan told me when I walked in the wheelhouse, I was just out of the wheelhouse for a few minutes. And he said, I'd just talked to Fitzgerald. He said he seems to be doing all right. That was at 7:10. That was the last transmission we had from him.
They checked the radar once more, and the Fitzgerald was about 10 miles ahead of them. The snow had let up, and visibility was returning. In the darkness, Anderson's crew watched ahead to get their visual bearings, spotting a few lights in the distance. As Anderson's crew oriented themselves, they determined that the lights that they saw were at Whitefish. They were shore lights, plus those of a few other ships taking refuge there. Then a real sense of concern set in. If they were looking at Whitefish, they should be able to see the Fitzgerald somewhere in between. Why can't they? Captain Cooper suggested that Fitzgerald may have lost power and told the men to watch out for a silhouette, but they saw none.
We thought, and the wheelsman said he thought he saw a light over toward Coppermine Point. But Morgan and I didn't see it, but he swears he saw it, and it could have been a car light up on the top of Coppermine Point, I don't know. But he said he saw it, and that would be entirely possible. It could have been the stern light on the Fitzgerald as she was going under.
The radar was becoming unclear at that point, with them receiving a lot of interference from the waves cluttering their reception, so they switched over to their other radar. On that radar, where they expected to see the Fitzgerald, was now nothing. The Fitzgerald did not respond to calls. They tried the emergency radio. Nothing. Cooper was worried that his own radio might be down, so he contacted another steamer, the William Clay Ford, anchored in Whitefish Bay, weathering the storm. The Ford answered, indicating that there were no problems with the Anderson's radio. Cooper frantically contacted several other ships in the area, asking if they heard anything of the Fitzgerald or saw anything on their radars. Nothing. She had simply vanished. Captain Cooper called the U.S. Coast Guard stationed in Sioux City. They were unable to muster anything and couldn't give Cooper's concerns the attention that it truly deserved. They were preoccupied with another search, however, and they asked Anderson to keep an eye out for a 16-foot civilian craft that was reported to be missing. As the Anderson neared Whitefish Bay, there were 3 ships steaming in the opposite direction coming out of the bay, passing within a mile or two of where the Fitzgerald was last seen. The Anderson contacted them to see if they had seen any sign of the ship. They should have, they were right there, but they didn't. Captain Cooper got right back on the radio with the Coast Guard, reiterating his concerns about the safety of the Fitzgerald. This time the Coast Guard listened. The radio communication from this point on was recorded in a now famous half-hour audio track. The voices of Captain Cooper and the U.S. Coast Guard were obviously concerned but remained professional as one of the most legendary dramas of the Great Lakes unfolded before them.
This is Group 2, and just for confirmation, sir, he couldn't see any lights pick him up on radar, is that correct? I don't know. I thought we were picking him up on radar when I came up here to wheelhouse and talked to the mate. The sea return is real bad, but we thought we had the target.
The Coast Guard was unprepared. They had small motor lifeboats available, but they would be no match for the storm. There was a 180-foot buoy tender launched from Duluth, but it was several hours away. Aircraft were ready, but they also would take some time to take off. With nothing else readily available, the Coast Guard asked the Arthur M. Anderson to go back out and search for the Fitzgerald themselves.
Do you think there's any possibility that you could come out and go back there and do any searching? Over. God, I don't know. The sea out there is tremendously large. If you want me to, I can, but I'm not going to be making any time. I'll be lucky to make 2 or 3 miles an hour going out back out that way.
The Anderson had just braved that storm and was asked to return to the site where the Fitzgerald was last seen to see if they could find it or find any sign of the missing ship. The captain hesitated because of how terrible this storm was raging. But he thought to himself probably that the Fitzgerald's crew would have done the same for him. They would have gone out looking for him, so he decides, you know what, I'm going to do it. And he turns the ship around and heads right back into the storm looking for the missing Edmund Fitzgerald.
The chief engineer was a little bit disgruntled when we were going to turn around and go back out, and he told one of the kids down there, was a maintenance man. This kid was a gung-ho sailor, young kid. He wanted to be in a real storm. That was his thoughts, you know. When the chief told him we were going back out, he went down to his tape recorder, made a last testament of it, will, put it in a jug and sealed it.
About an hour later, the Coast Guard put out an additional request to expand the search effort, calling on any other civilian freighters sitting in Whitefish Bay to join the Anderson in the search among this raging storm.
Missing Edmund Fitzgerald in your area. Request you search an area 15 miles due west, Copper Mines Point, Ontario, at 15 miles north of Cliff Point. Over.
There were several ships in Whitefish, sheltering from the rough seas both under the U.S. and Canadian flags when the Coast Guard put out this perilous request, and only one answered the call to join the Anderson, the William Clay Ford of Detroit, Michigan. An attempt was made by the Canadian freighter Hilder Marjan, but they couldn't get out of the bay given the overwhelming weather conditions. The Anderson battled the storm once more, rolling and heaving with every swell, making very little headway against the wind and the waves. Her searchlights scanned the sea, and her men kept watch for any sign of this missing ship. The William Clay Ford followed not far behind her, with her own searchlight shining. The Coast Guard deployed an HU-16 aircraft and an HH-52 helicopter that night to search from above.
I mean, they got over with the planes. You know, I was asking them to drop those flares right down my deck. They were reluctant to do that. They were afraid they were going to set me on fire with the flares, I guess, which would be impossible. But the flares were no good either, Tom. It cast such a yellowish light on the water. And the only way you can pick up an object in the big sea is when it's at the top. Otherwise, when they're trough, you don't see them. So it was an exercise in futility, I called it.
The night passed and turned into morning, with the Anderson and Ford still battling the seas looking for the Fitzgerald. And the longer it took to find them, the more their hope vanished.
I think it was 5:30 in the morning, just before daylight. Well, it was quite a bit before daylight. We started running through a lot of debris, gas tanks, like for the stoves, life preservers, oars, canisters, but no, it's no sign of anybody else. And that's another thing that bothered me was Tom is they've changed that now. They have the strobe lights on the life jackets. Well, they have them on the life jackets and on the ring buoys. But not one of those darn canisters lit up that went in the water. Not one. There was no way that we could have found a light. If there had been a light, we probably could have got there quicker. But there was no light on it. So at 5:30 in the morning, I called the Coast Guard at that and reported the exact position of it. And then we kept on going in a search. I kept going in that west-north direction. I didn't know if bodies would drift faster or what. I didn't know what the hell I'd do if I found one.
Finally, just after 8 a.m. the following day, the Anderson came upon half of one of Edmund Fitzgerald's lifeboats.
Oh, I can't remember the exact time now, but probably 11 o'clock in the morning, the third mate was still up in the bridge. And, you know, the fellows had spent all their time up there. And he spotted the lifeboat. There was only a half a lifeboat. It was down, yeah. It was down, off of, well, it was north of Caribou Island yet. But it was, it looked like a giant hand had just taken and torn it right in two. And there was still some tanks intact. That's the reason it was floating. Some of the, the inflatable tanks in there. But evidently they went to the bottom, and those lifeboats with that flotation they just lifted out of the saddles and just broke loose from their restraining gear.
The other half was found by the SS American Mariner. The second lifeboat was found at Coppermine Point in Canada by the Ontario Provincial Police. The boats were all empty. There was no sign of the crew, alive or dead, anywhere. The two lifeboats were badly damaged, as mentioned, one of them having been ripped in half. It was concluded that the boats were never launched. They tore free from the ship as it went down fast. Debris scattered the waves. Life rings and even life jackets, which had torn loose from the ship as she broke apart and shot to the surface. Two inflatable rafts were found floating, and the surface of the lake near the wreck was covered in a thick oil slick. Several items were found washed ashore as well. The Canadian Coast Guard joined in the search and set up patrols along the Canadian shores of Lake Superior in case anything else washed up. The U.S. Coast Guard cutter Woodrush finally came on scene several days later, after hitting delays, and by that point, it was painfully obvious that the Fitzgerald was gone and there were no survivors. A U.S. Navy P-3 Orion had detected a strong magnetic anomaly 17 miles off Whitefish Point, at a place only 1,200 feet from the U.S.-Canadian border on the Canadian side. And the Woodrush surveyed this with a side-scan sonar. Sure enough, two large pieces of wreckage were found from a freighter. Two more scans were done, and an underwater ROV was sent down the following spring to film and photograph the wreck. The Coast Guard produced a series of very detailed and accurate drawings of the wreck. Lacking comprehensive footage that we can pull from, we're going to refer to these drawings. The wreck is torn apart, more or less broken in halves. The forward half sits upright in the silt, badly damaged and banged up on all edges. Some of the hatchways, especially the forward two, have caved in. Taconite pellets are scattered everywhere over the forward half. The back half of the ship, the stern, lies between 150 and 200 feet away, slightly rotated from the bow and upside down. The wreck was found to be in two pieces, which immediately sparked a heated debate. Did she break apart as she struck the bottom, which would be a reasonable thing to happen, or did she suffer structural hull failure on the surface, indicating something seriously wrong with the ship? A former crewman named Richard Orgel had no doubt in his mind that the ship went down due to hull failure on the surface. He remembers seeing the ship bend and flex worse than any other vessel he'd been on when she sailed through storms. He remembers going into those access tunnels along the hull below deck and finding that the ship had flexed so much that the white paint on the wall was cracking and flaking off. He even wrote a book about this, titled The Edmund Fitzgerald Hull Failure. The former steward of the Fitzgerald, George Bergner, attested that he saw the welds in her hull were failing over time. A naval engineer who worked at the shipyard that she was built at the time that she was built, a man named Raymond Ramsey, also believed that with the new load lines given to the ship where she sat lower in the water, she wasn't seaworthy. He admitted that so many of the construction methods used in this revolutionary ship were actually untested, and he agreed that it's unlikely that the Fitzgerald would have been able to stand up to the weather conditions of that terrible Witch of November. The night she went down, in the immediate area of where she wrecked, even closer than the Anderson was, were 3 ships known as salties, slang for ships that sail in saltwater oceans as well as the freshwater lakes. These were the Nanfrey, Benfrey, and the Avaforche, the steamer that was in communication with McSorley shortly before the Fitzgerald was lost. The Fitzgerald was battered and wrecked, but the 3 salties made it through that night unharmed. Why? What was it about the Fitzgerald that did her in when other vessels were able to pull through, including the Anderson? The Fitzgerald's sister, the Arthur B. Homer, was retired 5 years after the Fitz went down. She was very similar to the Fitzgerald, and some speculate that concerns over her structural integrity played a factor in this, as she flexed dramatically as well. It's possible that given Fitzgerald's proneness to hogging and sagging, with fractures building up during her career, waves may have piled on the deck and simply broke her back that night, buckling the ship right on the surface. There were other freighters that sank like this on the Great Lakes. The Daniel J. Morrell in 1966 or the Carl D. Bradley in 1958. Both failed on the surface and sank. But these were older ships when they went down, and they can't really be used as a benchmark when studying the Fitz. There were several investigations into the wreck that came to different conclusions, but the 3 main ones were done by the U.S. Coast Guard, the Lake Carriers Association, which represented the company that owned the Fitzgerald, and the NTSB, the National Transportation Safety Board. None of them believed that the Fitzgerald broke apart on the surface. The Coast Guard and the NTSB believed that she nosedived, slamming into the seafloor, and broke her back as the bow dug in, the stern perhaps breaking loose for a moment, bobbing around, which could account for the taconite pellets scattering around the wreck, before the stern capsized and sank. The Coast Guard investigation stirred up a bit of controversy with their conclusions. They suggested that the ship's hatch covers were not properly closed, or closed at all in some cases, allowing for water to seep in and slowly flood the cargo holds. This kind of blames the crew of the Fitzgerald, implying laziness and corner cutting. The evidence for this theory wasn't strong. The families of the victims felt that this was the Coast Guard deflecting from themselves being so ill-prepared to launch a rescue mission, as well as their reduction of the freeboard requirement just before the disaster. Later dives on the wreck were able to prove that the hatches were properly secured, and computer tests by the NTSB proved that the ship didn't sink gradually, such as from a leaky hatch, but rather from a rapid influx of water, a quick sinking. She was limping, she was listing, she was taking on water, but her death blow came out of nowhere. So what caused her to sink so suddenly? The rogue wave theory is a common one. A rogue wave is a wave significantly larger than the rest of the waves, defined as more than twice the height of the mean of the largest third of the waves. There's a rogue wave phenomenon particularly associated with Lake Superior known as the Three Sisters. These are 3 rogue waves in quick succession, with each one stronger than the last. Evidence that this may have played a part is the fact that Captain Cooper recalled being struck by 2 massive rogue waves shortly before the Fitzgerald was lost. There could have been a third one that he didn't notice, and these waves were heading in the direction of the Fitzgerald.
And I just got to thinking about it afterwards. If those seas were that big, they rolled up his deck, and he's got a list, and the water stays up in the forward cabin, it's going to put his bow down under the water.
If coming in from the stern, which these waves would have, the first would have rolled over the aft deckhouse of the Fitz, moved along the spar deck, and then slammed into the back of the forward deckhouse. Before the wave could disperse from it, a second wave would have slammed hard into that same spot, adding even more water to that part of the deck. A third wave, if there was one, would have compounded the weight even more. With that weight, Captain Cooper is certain that the Fitzgerald would have nose-dived right to the bottom.
I think it was sudden and catastrophic. I mean, the ship just disappeared completely. I mean, and it had to just dive under, and then that stern screw or that screw on the ship just acted like a propeller, like a submarine, just drove it right to the bottom. That's my opinion.
Looking at the wreck, hatches 1 and 2, located right where that mass of water from rogue waves would have compounded, have fractured and buckled in, indicating a crushing weight was on top of those 2 hatches. There's no way to prove that Anderson's rogue waves ever hit the Fitzgerald, but evidence may support this theory. When the ship was in trouble, McSorley reported to Cooper that they had lost 2 vent covers, which investigators believe were the starboard tunnel and ballast tanks, leading to flooding and a starboard list. That crippled the ship, but with the pumps running, they were holding on. No doubt, though, her trim and level in the water made her more susceptible to waves breaking over her deck, contributing to her ultimate demise. Captain Cooper gave us another clue that might explain why the Fitzgerald was lost. As the Fitzgerald passed Caribou Island on the northeast, she crossed dangerously close to the 6-fathom shoal, closer than Cooper would have wanted to take the Anderson. In fact, it was discovered a year later in 1976 that the Canadian surveys of the shoal were wrong. It extended at least a mile farther out than previously known. The Lake Carriers Association concluded that most likely the Fitzgerald struck the reef and tore out a part of her bottom, letting the water fill the ship. If this is the case, then the Fitzgerald would have been flooding for about 4 hours before she slid under. 6-fathom shoal is shallow, with an average depth of around 30 feet. When fully loaded, the Fitzgerald's draft was 25 feet, meaning there's only 5 feet of clearance between her and the reef. If she's dropping in the troughs of the waves, rising and falling, she could easily drop those 5 feet several times in a single minute. If she dropped onto the reef, the hull would have essentially arched, a stress on the ship known as hogging. This would have accounted for the fence rail having been stretched and buckled. Captain Cooper later talked about the damage that she sustained topside and the fence rail being down. He says that's not going to get ripped down or anything like that. It would happen from hogging.
So my opinion is she bottomed out. For one thing, is the fence rails don't break with the ship sagging. They break with the ship hogging.
Which would have happened if she was on the reef, because then the fence rail would have stretched and buckled and fallen.
Now, an immediate list, again, tells me that he either had a stress fracture or he bottomed out. He said he had his pumps on. I asked him if he had his pumps on. He said yes. But he said later on he said that he wasn't gaining anything by pumping out on it, so the water was coming in the hull as fast as they were pumping it out.
If she grounded, evidence would likely be visible at intervals matching the wavelengths along her keel whenever she dropped down onto the reef in the waves. Looking at the Coast Guard drawings produced back in the 1970s, we can actually see some minor damage on the underside of the after section of the hull. Could this be from grounding, or could this just be from the impact with the bottom as the ship broke apart and sank? Can we trust this, or was this detail drawn in error?
To check that rumor out, the Coast Guard sent out an outfit out of Chicago, which was Dick Race and Neptune, which was a big salvage tug. Dick brought divers with him. They scoured the top of the shoal as best they could, found no indication of impact marks, no scrape marks, no paint marks. They found nothing that would corroborate the idea that she had hit Carol. Is that 100% perfect? Probably not. But it was an honest effort made to try and find out what happened.
Historian Frederick Stonehouse, and myself honestly, firmly believe that you cannot commit to any one of these theories. They all hold weight, and there is simply not enough evidence that we know of to put this matter to bed. However, his new book, published for the 50th anniversary of the wreck, leans towards the following timeline. 3 p.m., November 10th, 1975. The Fitzgerald makes her way through raging seas and howling winds. The Fitz had just disappeared behind the white veil of the storm, and the Arthur M. Anderson had just lost visual contact with her. At this hour, the Fitzgerald is in good shape. Shortly before 3:30, a wave smashes into the Fitzgerald's spar deck, bringing with it some heavy, floating object. A log? Some discarded shipping equipment? We'll never know. It smashes onto the deck, taking out the fence rail and 2 starboard vent covers up forward, allowing water to begin entering the vessel's starboard ballast tanks and crew tunnel. McSorley immediately activates his pumps, but they only slow the flooding. They don't completely counter it. Water floods the spar deck, being trapped by the 15-inch shear strakes along her sides, which don't allow much drainage. That water pools, adding weight to her topside and keeping it flowing steadily down into the now exposed vents. Seas flood into the starboard tanks, increasing the weight of the ship, increasing the stress on the hull as the raging seas pick up as well. As the ship sinks lower into the water, settling by the starboard bow, the waves are able to pound higher and harder against the ship, smashing into the forward deckhouse and breaking windows. Her crew accommodations flood, disabling the ship's radar. McSorley got onto the radio and called the Arthur M. Anderson, asking for radar guidance, racing against the inflowing water to get his ship to the safety of Whitefish Bay. As the forward deck lowered and the waves wreaked havoc on the forward deckhouse, the forward spar deck flooded more and more, with waves washing over the deck and not draining. Each wave piled on top, driving the bow down further. The hatch covers were only designed to bear the weight of 4 feet of water on top of them. Seas may have piled a dozen or more feet on top, causing the forward 2 hatches to completely give way. Now, her massive cargo hold, with no watertight subdivisions, is open to the sea. With this, the Edmund Fitzgerald is doomed. The seas, combined with 26,000 tons of iron ore, are too heavy for her as she rides over the waves, taking additional waves under her. She rolls and heaves, buckling in the center. Her keel gives way, but the decks hold on for a moment, twisting them upward. The bow, flooded, begins to drop as the stern breaks free, twisting and shearing. The starboard side buckles inward as the two halves sever further. The plunging bow drags the stern by the starboard hull, wrenching the stern onto her side, capsizing it. The bow sinks, slamming into the lake bed and coming to rest where she is today. The stern floats free for a moment, upside down and dumping her cargo out. Eventually she floods and sinks, remaining inverted as she slams down onto the lake bed, just 170 feet from the forward section of the ship. The whole plunge may only have lasted a minute or two. There was no time to launch a lifeboat. There was no time to send an SOS. Without survivors to have given their side of the story, there's no way to know what happened for sure. But there's no reason to believe that anyone aboard the Fitzgerald contributed to her loss. The captain took every precaution that he should have. The crew appeared to have managed the ship well, and she seems to have been loaded and readied correctly. Perhaps that's what's so haunting about this disaster. They seem to have done everything right. From the moment that they set their course, their fate was out of their hands.
In other news today, an air and sea search is continuing for possible survivors of the Edmund Fitzgerald, a 729-foot ore carrier, which apparently broke apart and sunk last night on Lake Superior. The ship and its 29-man crew vanished in a storm with 80-mile-an-hour winds and wave heights up to 25 feet. All that has been found is an oil slick and some debris.
The news broke not long after Captain Cooper made his call to the Coast Guard. First, she was reported as missing, but as search efforts proved fruitless, it became more apparent that she went down.
Well, I was quite frankly in a local bar in Marquette with some friends at the time I heard about the loss of the Edmund Fitzgerald, or what thought was the loss of the Edmund Fitzgerald. The initial radio information that came out, the news that was on the wire, really talked about they think an ore carrier was lost. It wasn't until the following day, I think, that they finally made that decision that she was indeed not at anchor in some lonely location, wasn't hauled up in a little harbor somewhere, but truly lost to the big lake.
This is the Mariners Church of Detroit, just a few paces from the riverfront where the Edmund Fitzgerald frequently steamed through. The following morning, as the missing freighter made front-page headlines around the Great Lakes, Reverend Richard Ingalls held a silent prayer service alone for the souls of the 29 men who appeared to have been lost on the Fitzgerald. After his prayers, he rang the church bell 29 times, once for each man. The media picked up on this story, and this became an annual tradition for the Mariners Church, which told 29 times every year to remember the victims. But it was a song written by legendary Canadian folk musician Gordon Lightfoot who thrust the story of the disaster into the spotlight of pop culture and solidified the memorial bell tolling as a key part of the Edmund Fitzgerald's legacy. You may have noticed a few lines of this song sprinkled into this documentary. He wrote the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald as the story was still unfolding, with investigations still pending. He did his best to maintain historical accuracy, but that's hard to do when the history wasn't even finished yet. It was written and recorded within about a month of the disaster, being released the following August in 1976. It charted at number 1 in Canada and number 2 with Billboard in the United States, becoming the second most successful song of his career. When Gordon Lightfoot died in 2023, He was remembered alongside the 29 dead of the Edmund Fitzgerald, the bell tolling a 30th time in Gordon's honor. As the investigations into the disaster concluded, recommendations were made to the Coast Guard, Lake Carriers Association,